I'm Brian Scordato, and this is the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. We accelerate ideas into real companies through the Tacklebox membership, and we think through startup strategy every Wednesday on the Idea to Startup podcast. You're here because you're thinking about an idea, or you're ready to launch something, or you already launched something and you're running full steam ahead. We're here to help with the counterintuitive stuff. On to it. Today, we've got a pod on running customer interviews using AI. We almost certainly aren't going to use AI in the way that you think we're going to, but we'll get there. We'll start by talking about humans. Humans are good at lots of things, but in my experience, the thing we're the absolute best at is avoiding criticism. We get even better at avoiding criticism when we're insecure about the thing that might be criticized, which is usually when we most need to be smacked in the face with that criticism. While this instinct is human, it's definitely learned. I read that something like only 2% of adults score as, quote, creative geniuses, but 98% of kids do. The fear of criticism eventually beats the interestingness out of us. My son is wildly creative, and he has zero fear of me saying the canoe he made out of our couch cushions isn't actually floating down the Amazon River. Anyway, most founders I meet are insecure about their idea because that idea has gotten so twisted and tangled up with their identity and self-worth that you can't tell where one starts and the other ends. They can't stomach potential criticism of that idea. Usually, the longer you've had an idea and the more fully formed it is in your head, the tighter it'll be aligned with your identity and the harder you'll push against hearing any potential criticism. So, watch out for that. The first thing we tell our founders at Tacklebox is to treat your idea like a patient on an operating table. We're the doctors huddled around that idea, trying desperately to save it. We aren't the ones lying on the table. That separation will keep you sane. Over the past 18 or so months, the question I've gotten the most by far is, can I use AI for customer interviews? Meaning, can I just interview ChatGPT as if it was the owner of a bike shop or an elementary school principal or whoever their customers are to avoid actually speaking with those customers? Founders suggest this will speed up the process, but it's just a veiled attempt at avoiding criticism. It's way easier mentally to just hire a dev shop or start vibe coding and get going on product. It kicks that criticism can down the road, and it can feel more like progress than talking to customers will. If you've ever met someone who spent 2 years working on a product, quitting their job and draining their savings in the process, only to find out that no one has the problem they built a product to solve, they aren't dumb or even bad entrepreneurs for not validating that first. They're just good humans who have mastered our secret art of avoiding criticism. So, no, we aren't going to just run customer interviews on ChatGPT and call it a day because, as we'll see, that's no better than just not running customer interviews, and honestly, it's probably worse. What we will do is use AI to make the interview process 10 times faster and more effective. But we won't use AI in the way most people are using it, to avoid discomfort. We'll use it to ramp up that discomfort. We're going to build a machine that'll deliver criticism directly to your front doorstep. Which might sound awful, but criticism is an acquired taste. Soon you'll get used to it, and then you'll seek it out, because you'll realize the criticism and feedback are fertile grounds for the insights you need for a successful business. So while everyone else is going to use AI to make their lives easier, we'll use it to make ours more uncomfortable in the short term. But before we get to our AI interview machine, we need to quickly talk about what the point of customer interviews are in the first place, the job we're hiring them to do, which starts with the worth your time to solve equation. The worth your time to solve equation. The early days of a startup aren't about product or team or funding. They're about finding a customer with a problem that is worth your time to solve. Digging into that sentence deeper, worth your time to solve has two components. First is what I call the overpay component. The problem you find is so important to this customer that they'll happily overpay you to solve it. Because without you, their options are horrible. And simply not solving the problem isn't one of those options. They're at the bottom of the well, and they need any sort of rope to get out. Continuing this analogy, the rope itself isn't the hard part. It's noticing the customer in the well. The overpay component is critical because if your first customer can't or won't overpay for your first product, your business probably isn't going to work. The second component is what we call asymmetric knowledge. This customer that's got this wildly important problem, you need to know more about them and their situation and their process and what success looks like to them than any competitor does. You need asymmetric information. If this combination seems like a tight needle of a thread, a customer with a problem they'll overpay to have solved, and a customer you know more about than anyone else, it is. That is why startups are difficult. But the good news is, you almost certainly won't start with all of this information, and you don't need to. This is the job of our customer interviews. It is what we're hiring them to do. To help you root around and find customers that might be good potential first customer candidates. Interviews are the first tool we've got to learn about their problem and their process. And honestly, if this sounds good so far and the rest of the pod does as well, you should just join our customer interview workshop we're running that starts September 15th. Link in the show notes and at gettacklebox.com. Sorry for the random ad, but man, writing this, it's just so clear. If you're actually prioritizing interviews, you should just come to that workshop. We'll get you all set up. Anyway, as I was saying, interviews are the first tool we've got to learn about problem and process. We will speak with lots of different types of customers. We'll learn exactly how they interact with the problem now, and then we'll try to surface edge cases. Small, cohesive customer segments, what we call SOMs at Tacklebox, that are disproportionately impacted by the problem or have unique scarcity and constraints around a solution. Reasons why the status quo is particularly difficult for them. Customer interviews, then, are about finding the edge cases where we can get a foothold. Back to AI, because I can feel you asking this question through your AirPods. Why don't I just ask AI for those edge cases? Well, if you type into ChatGPT, pretend you're a principal at a high school with 2,000 kids and a yearly budget of X and goals of Y and Z, and you're considering software to track attendance, then run an interview with ChatGPT, you're going to get responses based on the same information that any other person with an internet connection can get. AI, by definition, doesn't surface edge cases because it doesn't know edge cases. It knows the most likely path, which is not what we want. Interviews are about knowledge separation, you pushing yourself away from everyone else. That needs to be done in person. But there's an even better reason why this won't work. The process of customer interviews gives us about 50 other invaluable data points because customer interviews are a dry run of this person becoming your actual customer. Let's say you're trying to interview that principal. The first thing you got to do is find them. You've got to see if you have any connections to get a few principals on the phone with you. That tests your network. Once you've exhausted that network, you need to speak with some cold principals. So maybe you send cold emails or LinkedIn messages. You need compelling copy in those. And when those inevitably don't work, you need another path. Maybe it's through parents. Maybe it's showing up in person. Maybe it's education conferences. In those conversations, you'll learn about the other places principals gather, about how much they speak with other principals, about how they track and measure their school's success, about who they pit themselves against. Decisions are made on envy, not greed, and envy is irrational. It ain't showing up on ChatGPT. Getting 25 interviews with potential customers is 15% about what they say and 85% about testing sales channels and marketing copy and organic growth potential and finding design partners. All of your first customers will start as interviewees. The process of getting and running interviews is what we base our first customer decision on. It is just not skippable. And again, we can make the whole thing easier and more uncomfortable with AI. So let's just do it with the help of a fake startup I've been thinking about for a while. After a little smooth jazz. Hey, another plug. If the customer interview stuff is hitting you right, join our customer interview workshop. It starts on September 15th. Details are in the show notes, or you can go to gettacklebox.com and there's a pop-up at the top. Back to it. Whisper ideas. The idea we'll work through today, and in the second half of this episode, which will come out next week, is what we call a whisper idea. The term whisper idea is maybe the oldest one we've got at Tacklebox. It started back in 2013, after I'd moved on from Find Your Lobster. I was running one-on-one coffee chats with dozens of founders a week, trying to get my footing and decide what I'd do next, and I realized there were two types of entrepreneurs. The first came in and confidently told me their idea. This person had nearly always had the problem they were solving. They'd tried every other solution on the market to solve it, and then, out of sheer frustration rather than entrepreneurial spirit, decided to solve the thing themselves, often grudgingly. The second type came in and whispered. When I asked what they were up to, they'd cautiously look left and right, lean in real close, and in the softest voice possible, tell me their idea. The first person knew it was safe to shout their idea from the rooftops because the hard part wasn't coming up with the idea, it was solving it. The second thought that the only advantage they had over every other person in the coffee shop was that they'd thought of the idea first. The idea was the valuable thing, so they whispered. The rooftop entrepreneur, the first one, obviously is in a much better spot than the whisper idea entrepreneur. So, for the first 5 years of Tacklebox, I had a rule: no whisper ideas. But it's become clear that most founders have, at least at some level, a whisper idea. And customer interviews done properly are their ticket off that doomed path of thinking the idea or product is what matters. You can start with a whisper idea and build a successful startup. I've seen it dozens or hundreds of times. So today's startup example is a whisper idea, and that is on purpose because most people start with whisper ideas, and you've probably got a whisper idea, and that is just fine. For now, at least. You can't stay that way. The idea. I've been fascinated by high school sports for years. One of my earliest startup ideas was a LinkedIn for high school athletes that helped college coaches recruit them. The forces behind the idea were strong. Here were the big four. First, wild success for my customers, high school athletes, was a college scholarship. This was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. That is true wild success. Second, the status jump, aside from the potential scholarship, was a profile where you put up video of yourself playing sports. Making it easier for customers to show off is never a bad business idea, and it is possibly the best growth strategy ever created. Third, the economic buyer had extremely deep pockets and they were willing to pay. The high school kid wasn't going to pay, but their parent would, in hopes of getting their kid that aforementioned scholarship. And fourth, this wasn't just great for the kids, this made college coaches' lives far easier. So we knew what wild success looked like, we provided a status level jump, the customer had enormous willingness to pay, and there were great marketplace dynamics as a solution would solve problems for both sides. It didn't end up working, but the fundamentals were there. The story is for another pod. I've kept one foot in high school sports tech ever since. From the video cameras that now record every game and create clips for kids to the advanced analytics that now exist for lots of high school sports. The first whisper idea I had for today's pod was announcing. Lots of high school games are now live streamed so that grandparents and aunts and cousins can watch. The student athletes can study their game film and create clips that they push to their college recruiting profile or to TikTok. This is great. But the games have no announcers. My thinking was that announcers would make the whole experience more fun. Maybe people would watch more, engage more. Maybe this would open up advertisers, or maybe we'd figure out better production, creating a YouTube channel for schools that got more views and then advertising came, or something. But the idea just feels so flimsy. The criteria that made the recruiting idea strong, clear wild success, obvious status level jump, economic buyer willing to pay, just didn't exist for the interview idea without a ton of mental gymnastics. So I did what I recommend everyone with an idea do. Get on the phone with someone who has more insight into the industry than you do. I called my friend who happens to be a high school basketball coach and the dad of a star high school basketball player. I asked him about his last 3 months. I asked him to walk me through any problems that came up repeatedly, any urgent requests or questions from parents or faculty or his boss. I asked him how his boss, the AD, decided whether he'd been doing his job well or not. We talked for 45 minutes and a story emerged. He said that probably 60% of his players, and he said this was consistent across all the teams at the high school, were interested in playing college sports. The reality was that far fewer than that actually would, but a huge percentage of his time was spent interacting with parents who wanted their kids to play in college. They asked about events they should attend, how to contact coaches, if this might get them into a better academic school, what AAU teams to try out for. They asked for a path. This was as intricate and time consuming a process as applying to college, with the same amount of upside, but no system for managing it. He knew of one person a few towns over who had a consulting business that helped parents manage that process, but that person only worked with kids looking to play high Division 1 and get scholarships. What about everyone else? Wouldn't some clarity around how the heck you get your kid recruited by a Division 3 diving team be useful? We have a hypothesis. And now, finally, it's time to bring in AI. The AI interview machine. The time to start interviews is the second you've got a hypothesis you're feeling even moderately good about. It's this sort of inverse relationship entrepreneurs need to get comfortable with. Whenever you feel good, your next step should be to try and poke some holes in that thing you're confident in. So, I feel excited about this manage your kid's attempt at playing college sports idea, which means I need to seek some criticism, or, in softer words, visibility. Today, we'll go through the machine itself. Next week, we'll push the idea through it and get that visibility. The machine. There are 3 parts to traditional interviews. Top of funnel. This is customer selection, outreach, scheduling, and a CRM. The actual interviews. This includes the questions, the script, recording, and note taking, and follow up. And finally, decision making. Taking what you've learned from these interviews and using it to help you choose a path forward. Each of these parts have blockers. The biggest ones I've seen with our founders are, first, accountability. Actually doing the interview process in the first place. Because again, we hate criticism. Second, logistics. Everything from finding people to reaching out to them to tracking responses to following up. And third, synthesis. Translating 25 interviews that each might have lasted an hour into something coherent. Luckily, AI can help with a bunch of this. I'll go through how I approach an interview machine build, but the beauty of AI tools is personalization. You can tweak these ideas to build something that is a reaction to your blockers and capabilities. Wherever you see yourself slipping, figure out how AI can help create momentum. And that is the way I think of it. AI exists for when I need a boost. We'll start where everyone should start: accountability. If you're going to start running interviews, the first thing you got to do is make appropriate space for them in your calendar and in your brain. I could do my whole "we're all goldfish" rant and talk about how you've got to remove before you add, but hopefully you've heard that one already. So we'll jump right into asking my AI of choice, Claude, for the practical making space help. For me, accountability works best in 2 forms: blocks on my calendar and promises to people I admire. So I started by asking Claude to create a 30-day interview schedule. I told it that I wanted to speak with 25 people, 15 parents, 5 high school coaches, and 5 people who work in college recruiting or sports consulting over that month. I asked it to build out specific daily goals to get there, using the assumption that we'd have a 3% response rate. I made that number up, but it's usually somewhere between 3 and 10%, depending on the idea and how good you are at reaching out. Claude has access to my calendar, so I told it to create blocks of time where I had space over the next 30 days with tasks associated with each time block. Now, these tasks and time blocks are never perfect, but the calendar holds with specific tasks are pretty magical for me, particularly with the personal accountability hook, which was my next prompt. I asked Claude to draft an email I'd send to 10 people I look up to with details of my 30-day experiment. I also asked it to draft the second email I'd send in 30 days saying that I'd been successful. I sent the first and I scheduled the second. I'm on the hook. For good measure, and because I was messing with some of the Zapier tools, I had it create an email to send me every morning at 8 a.m. reminding me why interviews were so important in the first place and adding something inspirational. These emails aren't actually all that inspirational, though it is entertaining to see what a robot thinks will get me going in the morning. It's more just a reminder to my subconscious. This is the priority. This is what I said I'd do, and I'm on the hook for it. Remember? Okay, accountability is done. Next up, top of funnel outreach. The first blocker here is information management. You need a super lightweight CRM that shows the people you've interviewed, people you've reached out to, and has a place for tags. I use Notion for everything, so I had Claude create a simple CRM template for me in Notion. We went back and forth a few times until it felt right. The next blocker is finding people. So I had the robot brainstorm 50 ways to find parents of athletes, high school coaches, and college coaches or sports consultants. I pulled a few ideas from the list that I liked: booster clubs, local sports Facebook groups, and just showing up in person to speak with parents on the sidelines of games. I had Claude pump these into my calendar too. I then had it draft 3 outreach templates for interviews using, a prompt about myself. I said, quote, reach out in the way Brian Scordato from Tacklebox and Idea to Startup would reach out. And it was decent. There was problem language and some specificity and a decent call to action. It needed some tweaking, but it gave me a draft. I used the cleaned up version with some individual customization for most of the early high potential targets, leaning on our Tacklebox content a bit. I can maybe go deeper on this in another pod if it's interesting. I also created a Calendly link for scheduling ease and a set of follow-up emails and an easy unsubscribe button. AI might have no clue about edge cases, but it is incredible at generating comprehensive lists of obvious things and ideas that we would all forget without it. Next is the actual interview execution. AI isn't super helpful for the interview questions. We've got a bunch of content on that, and maybe I can go deeper on it in a follow-up episode if interested. But there are a few AI tools that are critical here, and they depend on whether the interview is in person or over Zoom. If the conversation is remote, I highly recommend Zoom over a phone call if possible. And during that call, use something like granola.ai to record everything. This will allow you to be totally present. Granola will give you a transcript of the call along with bullets. We'll use this again later. If you're in person and can't record or take notes, immediately after, jump into your AI of choice and turn on voice mode. This is one of my favorite AI use cases. Tell it that you just had a customer interview and ask it to prompt you with a bunch of questions about that interview, basically for it to interview you about what you learned during the interview. This is the best way I've found to get your thoughts out and recorded and transcribed in an accurate way. I started doing these a year or so ago, and I like the process so much that I do it even after interviews that have been recorded. Using AI as a tool to ask myself questions about the interview and recording responses has become a great data point. Which leads us to AI's last and by far most useful role: synthesis. After each interview, upload the transcripts and your thoughts to the AI you're using. This will start to create a massive, searchable, queryable database. When we started, I said that interviewing ChatGPT was a waste of time because there was no specific knowledge. Well, now you're creating a database of specific knowledge that you can reference. You can ask about patterns in your interviews, about the problems that came up most often, about the customers that had the biggest problem. You can ask about what you still need to learn or questions you should go back and ask specific interviewees because you forgot the first time. You will know things like 85% of your interviewees mentioned one concern, or that 15% of your customers said they'd spend more than $1,500 on a solution. When you add information on each interviewee, you might learn that parents with 3 kids were more likely to try X, or parents who played college sports were more likely to pay for Y. It is a customer segmentation cheat code. I give AI a lot of shit, but this is useful. The end. Criticism. This went on far longer than I thought, so I'll do a dedicated episode on the actual interviews I ran with parents, coaches, and sports consultants and how I built and used the machine. Hopefully, this overview gets you started. And again, if you made it this far, you should probably just sign up for the interview course. I hate to plug something so much, but it's just such a great way to get this all done. I started with humans hating criticism, and I'll end with it. We'll all bend over backwards to avoid the discomfort of someone telling us our idea is bad, or even just telling us it's not amazing. But critical feedback is the only way you'll actually build something useful. Give it a shot. And now it's time for me to get back to the couch. There's a canoe waiting to float me down the Amazon. This was the Idea to Startup podcast. Have a great week.